Hello, greetings, friends of Intelform. Welcome to the video tutorial for Intelarbol version 2. Once you have the plugin, run this installer, follow the instructions, and finish. When we open AutoCAD, this tab should appear in the ribbon. With the Intelarbol command here. Likewise, we can run the command from the command line by typing Intelarbol directly. We press enter, and we are now inside the command. Version 2 of Intelarbol has 4 sections: technical drawing, hyperrealism, grass, and elevation. We will cover each of these sections in this video and explain the plugin's workflow as we go through each example. So, let's begin. With Intelarbol, we can create vegetation from simple polylines. What I have here are simple rectangles created with polylines for the examples. We run the Intelarbol plugin. Select a type of vegetation. Let's start with the technical drawing section, Vegetation V1. Click. Then, the program asks us to select the polylines where the elements will be placed. We select this polyline and, in this example, we will leave the default options. We simply accept by pressing enter and the vegetation is created. This polyline can have any shape. For example, we can select several polylines. Let's create another one and try this. Intelarbol Vegetation V1. We select the 2 polylines, press enter, and the vegetation adapts to the shape we have defined. We must keep in mind that the drawing created is simple AutoCAD geometry: polylines, lines, fills, blocks, etc., and everything is created as a single general block. If we want to edit or delete any part of this block, we simply explode it and edit or delete what we see fit. So, you see, it's something simple and practical. Let's continue with Vegetation V2 we selected. Click on the polyline, press enter, and perfect. Our V2 vegetation has been created. Now, let's use Vegetation V1 and explain the first of the options, density. During the process of selecting the polylines where the elements will be created, some contextual options appear that we can change. Once we select the polyline or polylines, we click on density and it tells us. Enter the density in values between 0.5 and 1, where 0.5 is less dense and 1 is the most dense. The unit comes by default, but we can change it, for example, to 0.5. We press enter and the vegetation appears. If we create the same vegetation with the default value, we notice that where we placed 0.5, the vegetation is less dense than where we placed 1. Now, let's use Vegetation V2 and explain the void option. This option allows us to select spaces where we don't want any vegetation to be created inside. For example, if I have a large polyline and another one inside that represents a path, I run the Intelarbol command. Select my vegetation, the polylines where the elements will be created, and then I click on void. It asks me to select the polylines where no elements will be placed. I select the internal ones. I press enter and the voids are indicated in red. No vegetation will be placed here. I finish by pressing enter and we see how our instructions have been followed. Perfect. Let's continue with vegetation type C1. Intelarbol Vegetation C1. Click on the polyline where the elements will be placed. Intelarbol Vegetation C1. Click on the polyline where the elements will be placed. We change the angle to 45. For example, press enter, and the vegetation is created with the indicated angle. Let's continue with Vegetation C2. We can also vary the angle, for example, to 90 degrees. Perfect. Let's continue with Vegetation C3. And we take this opportunity to explain the scale. The scale allows you to change the size of the vegetation, making it larger or smaller. And it is very important because we must be aware of how much geometry will be created. There are two important cases. First, when the area is very small and the plugin tends to create little vegetation. Second, when the area is very large and the plugin generates too much geometry. In both cases, the program displays a message suggesting that we change the scale, reducing or increasing it respectively. For example, if we have a very small area and try to create vegetation with a default scale of 1, the plugin will tell us that the vegetation was not generated correctly and to reduce the scale. If we reduce it to 0.1, the vegetation is created correctly, but smaller. On the other hand, if the area is very large, the program warns us that it could take a long time and suggests dividing the area or increasing the scale. If we increase it, for example, to 20, the vegetation is generated properly. It's important to know the proportion of our drawing and be careful with this. Let's continue. C4 vegetation. Then C5. And then C6. Everything is perfect. Now we move on to G1 vegetation. This is ideal for small, garden-like areas. In large areas, it can be resource-heavy, but it looks great. Then G2 vegetation. Perfect. We finish with the technical drawing section. Let's continue with the hyperrealism section. It's important to explain that the blocks in this section use images, just like the grass section. These images are associated with a relative path that is created in the same folder where our drawing file is saved. When we use these types of vegetation, a folder called IDVM Pictures is created. When the vegetation is created, the folder containing the images is generated. That's why, if we want to share the drawing, we must also share that folder so the images don't get lost. If for some reason we delete it, we open the drawing again. We'll see that the images disappear, but we can go to Intelarbol, Hyperrealism, and click Refresh. This automatically links the images again. This section is very good. It's not common to see something similar in AutoCAD, and it really stands out. So that the vegetation doesn't stand out more than the technical part, we've added the transparency option. If we run Intelarbol and choose transparency, we can enter a value between 0 and 90, where 0 is opaque and 90 is very transparent. For example, 70. This will make the vegetation look more diffused. This transparency can be applied in all sections and types of vegetation. Let's keep creating vegetation. Enter 2. Enter 3. Enter 4. Enter 5. They all look great and have distinct styles. Next, we move to the grass section, which is ideal for grounds. If we apply it to an irregular shape, the vegetation adapts to the contour. There are also variations. Both are visually appealing. Finally, we get to the elevation section, which allows you to draw vegetation in a side view. Let's try elevation 1. It looks great. Then, elevation 2. Excellent. It's important to mention that the selected polyline should preferably be open and can have any shape. We run Intelarbol, elevation, profile 3. And the vegetation is created over the indicated line, ideal for profiles or cross sections. There's also a final type of vegetation, palm tree style, which looks great. We are done with this. We have seen all the vegetation types in Intelarbol. This version of the plugin is optimized to the fullest. Everything is done in a practical, simple, and lightweight way. If we save the drawing, we notice that, despite all the geometry and vegetation, the file weighs just 4 megabytes. In the first version, the files would end up being 30, 50, and even 80 megabytes. But in this version, everything has been optimized. We no longer have to worry about the file size. We can continue detailing, improving, and perfecting our work. That's all. If you have any questions or suggestions, I'll read them in the comments below. Greetings.